The trading posts wake up differently in October. Wood Quay, Hedeby Harbor, Burka's waterfront. Thatch roofs sag under the weight of rain. Smoke thickens the air. You see ships pulled high on the gravel beaches, ropes coiled, sails bundled. But walk the wharves, and you see something else entirely. Iron collars piled near mooring posts, timber pens built shoulder high, children pressed against their mothers in damp corners. Welcome to Gormanudur, slaughter month. Mid-October to mid-November in the Norse calendar, the month when animals get butchered for winter stores. The month when something darker happens too. When the year's captives go to auction before the harbor ice sets in, thousands of children torn from British shores, Slavic villages, Irish monasteries. Most will never see their families again. Many won't survive the cold. Who were they? Where did they end up? And what happens to a child at a Viking winter market? This script is researched and factual, using sources from the Journal of Archaeological Science, published in 2014 by Elise Naumann at the University of Oslo, and from the article The Slave Markets of the Viking World, published in Slavery and Abolition in April 2019, by Ben Raffield at Uppsala University. These are deep archaeological studies with isotope analysis and DNA evidence from actual graves, not general history. Now back to the information. Atar was plundered by the heathens. They carried off a great number of women into captivity. Great number, no exact count. But the phrasing tells you scale, not a dozen, not 50. Enough that the monks writing it down couldn't tally them individually. The raiders needed ships plural to haul the catch. Women meant daughters, meant girls under 10. Viking slave networks didn't discriminate by age. They discriminated by value. Young captives fetch higher prices, longer working life, easier to break. The annals don't say what month. But patterns emerge when you track the raids. Spring and summer for violence, autumn for commerce. The calendar dictated everything. Excavations at Wood Quay and Fishamble Street show structures built almost exclusively from perishable materials. Wood, straw, 2-meter-thick waterlogged layers preserved them. But here's what matters. 5 of the 6 iron shackles found at the rival port of Hedeby were recovered during harbor excavations. Dublin's archaeology follows the same pattern. Chains near the wharves, collars in the harbor mud. Ben Raffield's research published in 2019 argues Dublin's entire developmental trajectory was driven by slaving activity. The town exists because the trade exists. No slaves, no Dublin. Water temperature drops below 10 degrees Celsius. Ships can't risk the crossing to Scandinavia much longer. Sea ice forms in the Kattegat by late November. If you're a Viking trader with 40 captives in your hold, you have a decision window. Sell them now in Dublin where buyers gather. Or risk the winter voyage to Hedeby, where prices might be better, but half your cargo might freeze before you dock. The market operates on fear of weather, fear of loss, fear of captives dying before sale. Population around 1,000 at peak. 6 shackles found during excavation, iron collars with rivets, the kind that doesn't come off without a smithy. Excavations of the harbor complex revealed them clustered on the wharves. Sven Kalmring's research suggests Hedeby's wharves functioned as the town's major marketplace, meaning slaves were sold directly from ships. No pens, no holding area. Buyers inspect the cargo on deck. If you're a child standing in that line, you're trying to read faces in a language you don't speak. Trying to guess which buyer is least brutal. You don't get to guess. You get sold to whoever offers the right weight of silver. By the early 9th century, silver was being used for payment at Hedeby, Kaupang Burka. More than 80,000 silver Viking Age Arab silver dirhams have been found on Gotland. Another 40,000 in mainland Sweden. And those are just the ones that didn't get melted down into ingots and jewelry. The math tells you the volume of trade. 1 dirham in the 9th century weighed roughly 3 grams. 80,000 coins means 240 kilograms of silver moved through Gotland alone. What buys that much metal? Furs, amber, walrus ivory, and slaves, lots of slaves. 8 ounces made 1 mark. Legal documents from Dublin in the post-Viking period reference human pricing and silver weight, though exact figures don't survive. But the Laxdala saga gives us a data point. Melkorka, an Irish princess captured as a slave, was held alongside 11 other women in a tented booth at a seasonal marketplace. 12 women, temporary structure, seasonal timing. That's the model. Markets didn't need permanent buildings. They needed weather windows and buyer traffic. October markets weren't about comfort. They were about speed. Gormanudur started with the first new moon in October. By mid-November, the window closed. Earlier began Yule month. The winter solstice approached. Trade didn't stop, but it slowed. Ships that hadn't made port yet were gambling. A slave trader in late October had to move inventory fast, or feed it through winter. Food was the constraint. A captive adult needs roughly 1,800 calories daily. A child needs 1,200 to 1,500. Multiply that by 40 captives over 90 days of winter. you're looking at 4.3 million calories. That's 2,000 kilograms of grain, or 900 dried cod, or 350 kilograms of whale blubber. Storage costs money. Dead slaves cost more. Sell now. Sell cheap if you have to. But sell. The children didn't understand the calendar pressure. They understood cold. Excavations at Viking sites show interior longhouse temperatures could hit 15 degrees Celsius when well maintained with proper fires and body heat. But holding pens near the harbor, exposed to wind off the Baltic, you're looking at exterior temperatures. October in Hedeby averages 8 degrees. November drops to 4. A child from Ireland or the British coast isn't dressed for it. Homespun wool if they're lucky, linen if they're not. No cloaks, those got taken. Bare feet common. You lose heat from extremities first. Fingers, toes, ears. Frostbite sets and fast in children. Their smaller body mass can't generate heat fast enough. Excavations at Dublin haven't revealed large compounds or open spaces that might have functioned as public markets. Raffield's research suggests captives were held and sold from private properties, harborsides, and ships themselves. If you're storing humans in those conditions through October rain and November frost, you're losing some. Maybe 5%, maybe 10%. The sources don't give mortality rates, but they give clues. Ibn Fadlan's account from 922 on the Volga describes a slave girl volunteering to die with her master at a funeral. Before the sacrifice, she spent days drinking and singing, giving herself over to pleasure. The text notes, when a poor man dies, the slave doesn't get that treatment. When a slave dies, the dogs and carrion fowl devour the body. No burial, no ceremony. Disposal. That's the value calculation. 10 Viking Age individuals analyzed. 3 were found decapitated in double and triple graves. Isotope analysis published in 2014 by Elise Naumann at the University of Oslo shows major diet differences. The decapitated individuals ate primarily fish, high marine protein. The intact bodies in the same graves ate land-based protein, meat, dairy. The DNA analysis showed they weren't maternally related, different strata of society. Naumann's research suggests the headless individuals were slaves offered as grave gifts, beheaded before burial. The diet data tells the bigger story. Slaves ate the cheapest protein available, fish in coastal Norway, bread and thin porridge inland. Children ate worse. Naumann's isotope work reveals that many individuals had different diets as adults than as children. The interpretation? Children were often put in foster care with people of lower social status, slaves or servants. A child slave's diet would have been even more restricted, whatever scraps remained. But we can work backwards from capacity. Hedeby had a population of 1,000, maybe 150 to 200 involved in trade. Dublin after 840 had similar numbers. Burka in Sweden may be smaller. If each major trading hub processed 200 captives in the autumn market season, and children made up a third of that, you're looking at 60 to 70 children per port. 3 major ports means 180 to 210 children sold in a single season. Multiply across 20 years, 4,000 children. Across the century and a half of peak Viking Age slaving from 800 to 950, 30,000 children minimum, and that's conservative. It doesn't count the eastern routes, the Volga trade, the markets at Bulgar. The slave flows to the Abbasid Caliphate and Samanid Emirate via Khazaria. Ibn Hawqal wrote in 977 about a Viking slave trade extending across the Mediterranean from Spain to Egypt. How many children disappeared into those networks? The archaeology can't tell us. The silence is its own evidence. The reverse was true for males, meaning Nordic men in Iceland had children with women likely taken in raids from the British Isles. Some of those women were slaves, some were concubines. The distinction blurred. A study published in 2018 by researchers at the University of Iceland and Decode Genetics in Reykjavik traced the fate of thousands of slaves, mostly women, transported from Ireland and Scotland to the Icelandic colony in the 9th and 10th centuries. The genetic signatures show up today, diluted but present. Those weren't all adults. Children came too, either taken in the same raids or born into slavery after arrival. The etymology isn't coincidental. Archaeological evidence indicates raids targeting young people were common in capturing Slavic captives termed sakaliba in Islamic markets. Frankish chronicles describe Viking raids along the Elbe and Oder rivers in the 9th century, hauling captives east along the Baltic coast to Hedeby and Burka, then south via the Dnieper and Volga to Byzantine and Islamic buyers. Children were valuable in those markets. Easier to transport than adults, fetched good prices from wealthy households wanting trainable servants. The routes were well established by 850. Silver dirhams flowed north, slaves and furs flowed south, children were cargo. The Laxdela saga gives us a scene, a marketplace, tented booths. A man named Gilly buys an Irish woman named Melkorka from 12 women held together. She pretends to be mute, a defensive strategy. If you don't speak, you reveal nothing. You make yourself less valuable for some roles, but more valuable for others. A mute slave can't spread rumors or betray secrets. Some buyers paid extra for that. Melkorka's muteness was fake, discovered later when she had a child, but the tactic shows you the psychology. Captured people tried to game the system any way they could. A child wouldn't have that sophistication. A child would cry, would reach for the mother they're being separated from, would struggle. Viking law codes don't discuss how traders handled crying children. But the practical solution is obvious. You separate them before sale. A child sold alone brings fewer questions. Buyers don't want to deal with a mother's grief or a sibling's attachment. You sell the child first, to someone heading inland or across the sea. Then you sell the mother to a local buyer. By the time she realizes her child is gone, the ship has sailed. Population estimates range from 500 to 1,000. The shackles were found in dwelling areas, not concentrated at the harbor like Hedeby. That suggests a different model. Slaves housed in the town, sold from private properties or merchants' yards rather than directly from ships. If you're a child in Burka, you're held in a structure. Maybe a small house surrounding a large central property. Maybe an outbuilding, straw on the floor, wooden benches along the walls, no heat source. You're with other captives, mixed ages, mixed origins. Some speak your language, most don't. You wait. Days, maybe weeks if the trader's waiting for better prices. You eat porridge, fish if there's any, bread if you're lucky. You watch the door. Every time it opens, someone gets taken. You don't know if they're being sold or killed. You don't ask. You wait your turn. The children who survived sale faced years of labor. The legal status of thralls in Norse society was explicitly defined. As two Viking scholars observed 50 years ago and research still cited today, the slave could own nothing, inherit nothing, leave nothing. They were not paid. In some circumstances, they were allowed to retain a small portion of proceeds from selling goods for their owners. Theoretically, a thrall could purchase freedom. In practice, almost none did. A child slave had even less agency, put to work in fields, tending livestock, hauling water, grinding grain, turning wool into thread, tasks scaled to a child's strength, which means the hardest, most repetitive, most tedious work. 12-hour days standard, longer in harvest season, no days off. The work didn't stop in winter. It shifted. Wood chopping, fire tending, shoveling snow. Caring for animals in stalls. A child's hands crack and bleed in cold. Chilblains form on fingers and toes. Infections set in. No treatment. You work through it, or you get beaten. Ibn Fadlan's account notes that when a chieftain died, his slave girls were asked who would volunteer to die with him. The girl who volunteered was then forced to go through with it. Even if she wished to back out, she wouldn't be allowed. On the day of the funeral, the volunteer was given intoxicating drinks and made to sing. She was lifted into a tent on the ship where the dead chieftain lay. 6 men entered and had intercourse with her. Then an old woman called the Angel of Death looped a rope around her neck while 2 men pulled. The old woman stabbed her between the ribs. The men beat shields with sticks, so her screams couldn't be heard, and other slave girls wouldn't be frightened from volunteering in the future. That's the documented ritual from 922. The functional purpose was clear. Terrorize the living slaves into compliance by showing them that even a voluntary death wasn't gentle. A child watching that wouldn't forget. Flagstad showed 3 decapitated bodies, but archaeological surveys across Scandinavia show more. A mass grave discovered in 1998 at Sigtuna in Sweden contained remains of at least 20 individuals, 13 men, 5 women, 1 child, age range 7 to 55 years. At least 11 skeletons displayed perimortem sharp force trauma from bladed weapons. Unhealed, injuries on women, men, and the child. Multiple blade wounds on some bodies. The observation of sharp violence trauma indicated the group was unarmed and without possibility to actively defend themselves. DNA analysis showed the majority of individuals were not maternally related. 2 possible pairs of siblings or mother-child relationships were identified. The conclusion from researchers? Possible slave group killed in an attack, or farmers. The archaeology can't definitively separate slave from peasant, but the pattern holds. Violence, mass burial, no ceremony. Parasite loads in Viking Age sites show intestinal worms were common. Tapeworms, roundworms, giardia from contaminated water. Dysentery killed quickly. A child with severe diarrhea loses fluids fast. Dehydration sets in within 24 hours. In a slave-holding pen with dozens of people sharing space and no sanitation beyond a pit, disease spread instantly. You couldn't quarantine. You couldn't treat. The sick died within days. The bodies got disposed of, flung into pits outside town limits, or dumped in rivers. Downstream from the settlement, so the water supply stayed clean. Archaeological surveys near Viking trading towns sometimes find bone pits, disarticulated remains, no pattern, no grave goods, just disposal. Some of those bones are children. The isotope signatures match the diet of slaves. High fish protein, low meat. The evidence piles up, even when names don't survive. Just the outcome, resistance crushed. The story's inclusion tells you revolts happened enough to warrant recording. Not common, but not unheard of. In 940, an Irish bishop held on Dalkey Island near Dublin died in an escape attempt. He was an adult, high status, still died trying. A child's chances would have been worse. No resources, no allies, no knowledge of terrain. Where do you run? You're in a foreign land where you don't speak the language. You don't know which direction is home. You don't even know if home still exists. Maybe your village got burned. Maybe your family got killed in the same raid that took you. You run anyway, because the alternative is staying, and staying means years of labor followed by an early death. They preserved the structure that kept them trapped. Geography, language, legal status, violence, all designed to ensure a captured child stayed captured. The system worked. We know because 30,000 children disappeared into it over a century and a half, and almost none came back. What about buyers? Who purchased a child slave at a winter market? Wealthy farmers needing labor, ship owners requiring deckhands, craftsmen wanting apprentices they didn't have to pay, households needing servants, sexual predators. The sources don't differentiate buyer motives. They only document transactions, silver for bodies, weight measured, deal struck. The child changes hands. Where they end up depends entirely on who bought them. Some luck into households where brutality is minimized, where the work is hard but not impossible, where enough food exists to keep them alive. Others end up in households where rape is routine, where beatings happen daily, where food is scarce and work is constant. It's a lottery. The child doesn't know which they've drawn until weeks or months into their servitude. Let's talk about sexual exploitation directly. The sources dance around it with euphemisms, concubines, bed slaves. But the DNA evidence strips away the politeness. 2/3 of Iceland's founding female population had Gaelic origins. Those women didn't volunteer to cross the North Atlantic with Viking men. They were taken, and many of them bore children to their captors. Some of those relationships might have involved eventual marriage. Norse society did allow for freedmen and freed women. A wealthy man might free a concubine and marry her if she bore him sons, but that was the exception. The norm was exploitation. A captured girl of 12 or 13 was considered old enough for sexual use. Norse law codes don't specify minimum ages for concubines. The absence of restriction is the permission. A child slave had no recourse, no one to report to, no protection. If the owner wanted to rape her, he did. If he wanted to lend her to a friend, he did. If he got her pregnant, the child became his property too. Another slave. Another generation trapped in the system. Ibn Fadlan's account specifically mentions slave boys as well as slave girls when asking who would die with the chieftain. Boys were valuable for physical labor, hauling, chopping, rowing, and boys were vulnerable to sexual abuse just like girls. The sources don't discuss it explicitly. But the pattern of adult male owners with absolute power over child slaves tells the story without needing details. Abuse happened, frequently, with no consequences for the abuser. Transported across water to a place where they don't understand the language, sold to a stranger, put to work immediately in harsh conditions, beaten if they work too slowly, starved if they displease their owner, sexually abused with no possibility of protection. Watching other slaves die and knowing they might be next. How does a child survive that mentally? Some don't. The historical record occasionally notes slaves committing suicide, jumping from cliffs, drowning themselves, hanging. The frequency isn't recorded. But the fact that it's mentioned at all tells you it happened enough to be noticeable. Anger brings worse, so they learn to show nothing, to become a tool, a thing, not a person. That's how you survive. By dying inside while your body keeps working. Some children adapted so completely they forgot their original language, forgot their birth names, forgot where they came from. That was the goal of the system, not just to extract labor, but to erase identity, to turn a person into property so thoroughly that they couldn't imagine being anything else. Children of slaves who never knew freedom? By the second or third generation, the system became self-sustaining. You didn't need to raid for new slaves when your slave population was reproducing. A female slave of childbearing age could produce 4 to 6 children over her lifetime. Half die in childhood from the conditions. That still leaves 2 to 3 new slaves per mother. Multiply that across a population where 10% are slaves, and you've got demographic momentum. The raids continued anyway, because fresh slaves from outside brought new labor and kept the breeding stock diverse. But the core population was homebred, children born into chains, who never knew any other life. October and November sales catch the tail end of raiding season. Ships return from Britain, Ireland, Francia, the Baltic, with whatever captives they grabbed. Traders need to unload inventory before winter, because feeding captives through 3 months of cold costs more than the profit margin on some sales. So prices drop, buyers get deals. A child who might cost 3 marks of silver in June costs 2 marks in November. If you're a buyer looking to expand your slave workforce, autumn is when you shop. The traders take the loss because the alternative is bigger losses. Every business operates on the same logic: sell or spoil. Children sold in autumn have 6 months to adapt before the heavy labor of spring planting. A child purchased in November spends winter indoors mostly, learning routines, learning enough language to follow orders, getting broken to the work. By April, when the fields need plowing and the livestock need moving, the child is already integrated. Bought in April, they'd be useless all summer, too green, still grieving, still fighting. Bought in November, they're functional by spring. The timing isn't accidental, it's designed. If you value documented archaeological research like this, subscribe. It directly supports deep dives into primary sources. Also comment from which city you're hearing this from. Now back to the information. In 980, Mael Sechnel MacDomnell, the southern Uí Néill king, stormed Dublin. He released all the Irish slaves in the port from captivity. A political move as much as charity, it imposed an economic disadvantage on his defeated enemies and served as a rallying point. But the trade didn't stop. It relocated, shifted to smaller ports, went underground, continued in the eastern markets where Christian morality held less sway. By the 11th century, as Christianity spread through Scandinavia, the trade began to decline, not from moral awakening, from economic pressure. England passed a law in 1102 banning human trafficking. That cut off a major market. Ireland couldn't sell to England anymore. Dublin's slave market became less profitable. Other European kingdoms followed, slowly, by fits and starts. But the direction was clear. Slave trading was becoming bad business. The margins had disappeared. Alternative labor systems had developed. Serfdom replaced slavery in much of northern Europe. A serf was bound to land but not owned outright. The distinction mattered legally. Practically, it was still exploitation. But it was exploitation with slightly better survival odds and slightly more legal protection. A thin improvement, but enough to shift the system. The last document mentioning a slave in Sweden is a will from 1310, which manumitted a male slave named Carolus. By the time of formal abolition, very few slaves remained. Most had already been freed, not from kindness, from economic irrelevance. The system had moved on. Slavery didn't end because Vikings became better people. It ended because better exploitation methods emerged. Some survived to adulthood and bore children of their own who were born into the same chains. A few escaped, fewer still were freed. The DNA traces remain in modern populations. Gaelic markers in Icelandic genomes, Slavic markers in Scandinavian bloodlines. The genetic evidence of rape and forced reproduction spread across generations. Those children didn't get to write their stories. They didn't get monuments or sagas. They got labor and death and unmarked graves. Every isotope analysis showing slave diet patterns. Every DNA study revealing non-local origins. Every mass grave with children's bones. The evidence accumulates slowly, piece by piece. The picture emerges. 30,000 children minimum over a century and a half, torn from homes. Sold in winter markets. Disappeared into labor systems that killed most of them before they hit 30. The numbers are conservative. The reality was likely worse. A few years ago, archaeologists excavating near Wood Quay in Dublin found a small leather shoe in a waterlogged layer dated to the mid-9th century. Child's size, maybe age 6 or 7, worn through at the sole, patched once with a scrap of different leather, then discarded when the patch failed. That shoe walked Dublin's wharves during the height of the slave trade. Some child wore it, felt it rub blisters on their heel, felt the patch come loose. That child might have been free, might have been a merchant's daughter. Or might have been a slave, standing barefoot on cold stones after the shoe finally broke, waiting to be sold to someone heading north where winter would kill them by December. One artifact among thousands, but it walked through the market. It stepped on the same stones where children were sold. And unlike the children, it survived. And the cold knowledge that for every artifact we find, 1,000 stories dissolved into mud with no trace. The children are gone. The markets are gone. The traders are gone. What remains is the question no one in 850 was asking. What happens to a child at a Viking winter market? Now we know. They vanish. They work until they break. And when they break, even their bones betray how little they ate and how hard they served. And that's the answer. That's what happened. That's the truth the sources tried to bury and the archaeology keeps digging up. Cold, documented, real. The shoe is a fragment, a single tangible piece of a life otherwise erased. But the child who wore it in Dublin was part of a system that stretched far beyond the Irish Sea. The markets at Wood Quay, Hedeby, and Burka were the western terminals of a network. That network had another arm, a bigger, older, and arguably more brutal artery that ran not west, but south and east, down the great rivers of the Slavic lands, the Dnieper, the Volga. This was the domain of the Rus, the Scandinavian traders who gave their name to a future nation. And the children they hunted were not Irish or British. They were the Sakaliba, the Slavs. They were sold at the nearest hub. The Eastern trade was different. It was less a raid and more a harvest, an organized, systematic depopulation of the lands along the river routes. The target was the wealthiest market in the world, not Scandinavia, but the Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad and the Samanid Emirate in Bukhara. These empires had an insatiable demand for furs, for honey, for wax, and for humans. A trader based in Burka or Gotland might spend the winter assembling goods. In spring, they sail east across the Baltic. They enter the Neva River. They reach Lake Ladoga. They stop at the fortified settlement of Aldigirborg. This is the gateway. From here, the choice is made. South down the Volga to the Caspian Sea and the markets of the Caliphate. Or south down the Dnieper, portaging around rapids to the Black Sea and the markets of the Byzantine Empire in Constantinople. Both routes were perilous. Both were paved with the bodies of children. The portages were the filter. The Dnieper route had 7 major rapids, places where the river was unnavigable. The Ruses had to pull their ships from the water, drag them overland for kilometers on log rollers. This was the moment of maximum vulnerability. They were slow, exposed. The Pechenegs, nomadic steppe warriors, knew this. They waited at the portages. They attacked the caravans. A Viking trader didn't just have to feed his captives. He had to defend them. And if an attack came, captives were expendable. A child who cried or slowed the group down, left behind, or killed to silence them. Only the strongest or luckiest slaves made it to the Black Sea. A child was easier to transport on the long river journey. They ate less, they were less likely to mount a successful rebellion, and they were a blank slate. A child slave bought in Baghdad could be raised speaking Arabic, could be converted to Islam, could be trained from age 8 or 9 for a specific role. Their identity could be systematically erased and rebuilt. That made them more valuable than a defiant adult. Castrated slaves guarded harems, served as tutors, or became high-ranking court officials. The castration itself was a brutal, often fatal procedure, usually performed on boys before puberty by specialized slave merchants. The price for a surviving eunuch was astronomical. 10 times the price of an intact slave. The profit margin created the supply. Viking traders knew this. They sold young boys to the merchants in Khazaria or Bulgar, who would perform the operation. The child had no say. The trader collected his silver and returned north. The girls faced a different, but equally terrifying fate. The harems of Baghdad and Cordoba were vast. They required a constant supply of new women. Girls taken from Slavic villages at age 10 were sold into these households. They were trained as servants, as musicians, as dancers, and as concubines. A child purchased at 10 might spend 3 or 4 years in training before being presented to her master. Her entire life was defined by this service. If she bore a child to her master, her status might improve. Her child would be born free, but she remained property. The scale of this eastern trade dwarfs the western one. We count silver dirhams in the tens of thousands in Scandinavia, 80,000 on Gotland alone. That silver was payment. Payment for what? Furs were valuable, but not that valuable. The texts are clear. The primary export of the Rus was human. Historians estimate that for over 2 centuries, the eastern trade moved thousands of slaves every year, tens of thousands, perhaps hundreds of thousands over the entire period. How many were children? We don't have exact numbers, but the market logic holds. Children were the preferred cargo, resilient, malleable, profitable. The massive silver hoards, we also find the weapons. The graves of the Rus traders are filled with swords, spears, and axes. They were warriors as much as merchants. They had to be, to defend their cargo from rivals and nomads. And we find the graves of the slaves. Or rather, we don't. Just as in the West, the anonymous dead were disposed of, left at portage sites, thrown in the river, buried in unmarked pits outside the walls of Bulgar or Kiev. The homebred slave? This is the second generation. The child born in a longhouse in Norway to a captive Irish mother. This child's reality is different and perhaps psychologically worse. They never knew freedom. They never had a home to be torn from. The longhouse, the master, the constant labor. That is home. The archaeological isotope data from Flagstad is the proof. The free children eat meat and dairy. The slave child eats fish and gruel. They see the master's children learning to read runes or training with weapons. They learn to carry and serve. They learn the geography of the farm, but they are forbidden to leave it. Like an animal, the purpose is to extinguish any spark of defiance before it can even form. They have no name but the one the master gives them, no family but the other slaves, and those connections are fragile. The master can sell the child's mother or brother or sister at any time. The Heimageddon child learns not to form attachments. To love anything is to invite pain when it is taken away. The boys become the core labor force. They are the ones digging ditches, building walls, and rowing the ships. They have no hope of buying their freedom. A homebred slave has no way to earn silver. They own nothing. They are nothing but a piece of the master's property, an animate tool. This is the system that Christianity eventually encountered, and it did not end it. It absorbed it. When Norse chieftains converted to Christianity, often for political and economic reasons, they did not free their slaves. The church itself owned slaves. What changed was the source. Christian law forbade the enslavement of other Christians, but pagans? Pagans were fair game, so the raids simply shifted. Instead of raiding Christian Ireland, Viking, now Christian, lords raided the pagan Baltic lands, Estonia, Finland, Lithuania. The children sold in the markets of the 11th and 12th centuries were no longer Irish. They were Finns, or Estonians. The machine just needed new fuel. The Irish bishop, who died trying to escape Dalkey Island. Melkorka, who pretended to be mute. These people knew they were free. The Heimageddon did not. Their resistance was smaller, more hopeless. A broken tool, a spoiled meal, a moment of sullen silence, or the ultimate act of despair, suicide. The sagas mention it. A thrall hangs himself in the barn. A slave girl drowns herself in the fjord. These are not stories of glorious defiance. They are footnotes of unbearable misery. A slave mother, knowing her child will be born Heimageddon, that it will be born property, might make a terrible choice. To kill the newborn, to spare it the life she has endured. This leaves no mark in the sagas. It leaves almost no mark in the archaeology. A newborn's bones are tiny, fragile. They dissolve in acidic soil, they vanish. This is a silence so profound we can only infer it. We see the birth rates, we see the child mortality, and we are left to wonder, how many children were lost in this way? How many mothers took that one final terrible act of control? So we have two streams of lost children. The thousands sold east, vanishing into the caliphate, leaving only the echo of silver coins in Swedish soil. And the thousands born into slavery in Scandinavia itself, vanishing into the labor system, leaving only the chemical signature of a poor diet in their bones. The numbers are staggering. 30,000 from the west, hundreds of thousands from the east, generations of homebred slaves. The true total is unknowable. It is a number that represents millions of broken families, millions of childhoods erased. A serf was tied to the land. The Lord didn't have to feed or house him. The serf fed himself on a small plot, and in return gave the Lord half his labor. It was a better deal for the Lord. The cost of maintenance was transferred to the laborer. The slave who had to be fed and housed year-round became a bad investment. So the thralls were freed, not into liberty, but into serfdom. They were given a new, slightly different set of chains. The kings, the earls, the warriors. The slaves are background, scenery. They are the ones holding the horses, serving the mead, or being sacrificed on a funeral pyre. They are never the hero. They are not allowed a story. The iron collars in Hedeby harbor, the isotope data from the graves at Flakstad, the decapitated bodies in the Sigtuna mass grave, the 80,000 dirhams on Gotland. These fragments are not just artifacts. They are the only testament these children have. They are the footnotes that challenge the main text. They are the physical proof of the lives the sagas ignored. They built it on the children they stole, the children they sold, and the children those children bore who never even knew there was a world outside the fence. That is the other side of the Viking Age, the side that doesn't make it into the sagas. The side that has been waiting in the cold, waterlogged earth to be found, and it tells a story not of glory or adventure, but of a relentless, commercial, and systematic consumption of the young.